So vigilance subtypes associated with ADHD. ADHD is a very common DSM category. Not a huge fan of the DSM, but it's still what we're stuck with. And here we are looking at it in terms of vigilance regulation. So folks here with vigilance autostabilization syndrome tend to map into this hyperactivity subtype with unstable vigilance regulation. Through, very common that we see cognitive deficits come with this, and that's more consistent with this inattentive subtype. If you've got a mix of both, that tends to put you in the category for combined. So common medication predictions for ADHD. If we have frontal midline theta, this points towards a need for striatal dopamine, and Ritalin is generally what's going to be most effective for you or for your clients, really. Slow alpha phenotype, they're going to need more norepinephrine from the brainstem, and this points towards Adderall as the likely candidate. But things to consider. So when we look at an inattentive ADD case, this is in fact a 10-year-old boy with spike and wave. So this is a kid who's got inattention, stares out the window, spacey, often missing what's going on in the room. And I really hope that I didn't need a red box to point out that here we are with a pretty well-regulated brain, and there is a profound disturbance in the frontal lobe, and the function is greatly compromised. And when we consider the Hippocratic Oath to do no harm, let's really consider what would be the case if we were to give this child Adderall. And this child was not, in fact, put on Adderall. So please don't twist what I'm saying here. But here we're looking at the same file, inattentive ADD with polyspike and wave. Profound disturbance of the frontal lobe. And polyspikes, these are in fact beta spindles. This is cortical. But this is a deeply disturbed brain. And how would you know? There's really only one answer here. How would you know? You have to look. We have to look at the EEG in these cases. And when do we know whether it's this case or not a case? We don't. So we have to look. So different phenotypes when it comes to this ADHD subgroup. And you can see here with this frontal slow, we're looking at about 27% are going to have that. Slow alpha peak frequencies, again, about 27%. If you're looking for a diagnosis, this is not super reliable. It predicts the way the brain is functioning, which gives you, with a little bit of a clinical intake, a good direction to go. But it does give you a really good window into what you can do to help this person. Now, I've also highlighted the mu rhythm here. Mu is an idling of the mirror neuron system. And when we look at that, given the social context that we're all in and the fact that we're not all gathering as a community, what's up with the masks? And, with an idling of the mirror neuron system, this is deeply involved in how we experience empathy. And folks with ADHD or this particular phenotypical presentation often boundary tests relationships quite a bit. Generally, they don't feel super met. So they ratchet things up until they feel met by their environment. It's a tendency oftentimes that negative feedback is desirable to no feedback. So, something to consider when you work with this population clinically is that if you really meet them in a compassionate way, don't give away your boundaries, but I hear you, I see you, they will relax. If you back them into a corner, you're going to have a huge conflict and they won't back down. They'll get so triggered. But if you can just meet them where they're at and then hold your boundary, I think you're going to find clinically that's really useful. When it comes to the mu, there's so much social divide around this, but I would anticipate that folks in this category, upwards of 45% of the population categorized as ADHD, I would imagine these folks have a really big resistance to wearing masks. They find it incredibly triggering. I don't really have any answers around this, but something we should all be considering in our efforts to keep everyone safe. How much harm are we doing? So I realize I'm a bit short on time, so I'm going to speed up a little bit here. Here we are looking at ADHD medication selection using the Vigilance modeling. Here we are looking at A1. There's another cluster down here at the B2, B3 stages. These folks, have relatively high vigilance, and these folks are relatively low. When medication is prescribed based on this model, what we see is a convergence of performance in cognitive performance tests. This was done with the ANOVA based on reaction time, commission, omission, and total errors. And what we see is a confluence of performance across these categories. That doesn't mean that I'm saying that we should put everybody on meds. We do know that often wrapped into this diagnosis is a circadian rhythm issue or sleep issue. So what are the long-term effects of giving stimulants to people with an underlying sleep disorder? I'd say that it's pretty risky long-term of what is really going to happen here. So vigilance regulation in bipolar disorder. I mean, this is a case, a very serious diagnosis in these manic episodes. And, when we're looking at this was taken from, vigilance modeling or Vigil, software available in the marketplace. And this is a 10-minute recording. And this is samples where there were 2 seconds that were consistent over this 10-minute period. And what we see here in these manic episodes, and, manic phase is, auto-regulation gone wild, out of control. But when we see this, we see that in fact, when they do go to lay down or close their eyes, they drop all the way down here to this B1 state. Where with the depressive episode, these are people who are socially withdrawn, all the classic symptoms of depression, low energy, low motivation. But in fact, their vigilance regulation is incredibly rigid. And the complexity that I implied earlier, I believe holds up. And this is really a case where it's really important to get curious with your clients. How are you sleeping? If they're using something like an Oura Ring that will track their sleep, very helpful. But you really want to inquire into your clients and find out how are they resting. And that will give you a good indication about how to interpret this information. Differences of phenotypes with depressors versus controls. Here's this frontal alpha asymmetry, less than 40%. If we were to add up the frontal beta and this central beta spindling, we really get to where there's really not much of a categorical difference statistically between the frontal alpha asymmetry group and the beta spindling groups, which makes this a pretty risky hill to plant one's flag on when it comes to selecting medication without actually looking at the EEG. If we just go off the clinical presentation, we've got a plus or minus 50-50 chance of getting it right. Those aren't great odds. And here with the mu, notice it's very, very low. And I maintain a place of curiosity socially that perhaps when people are really pro-mask, maybe there's something deeper going on, and it's not all about fear about a virus, but a fact that removing many of the social cues and nonverbal communicative tools is actually really comforting for these folks. So, medication predictions for depression. This comes out of the STAR-D study. 38.6% were put on these trials. What they found after, a bit of time was, I think it was 4 weeks, is that, 33% of them reported that the medication they were on didn't help their symptoms, but they were kept on the medication. So something to consider. Atypical medication predictions. This comes from Grandma Was Right. This is from the Gunkelman 2014 paper. 10 to 14% of folks with ADHD have unexpected epileptiform content or paroxysms. This is like 1 in 4. What if it's 10%, 1 in 10? Let's consider the Hippocratic Oath. If it's 1 in 10, how many of these folks should get an EEG screen before they get put on a stimulant medication? I maintain that there's really only one answer here, and unfortunately, it's all of them. If we're doing neurotransmitter tests and various vitamin deficiency tests, stool tests, it seems to stand to reason that we should consider exploring brain functions as one of the things we're considering when we make medication selections. For folks with mu, consider oxytocin to improve social presence. Antipsychotics are going to increase the firing potential of the brain. We may, in fact, evoke a breakthrough epileptiform discharge. The only way to know is to look. Coming back, SSRIs, for if you give this to people with excess beta spindling, it's going to make their symptoms worse. Due to time, I can't read all of these out. I've only got 4 minutes until my overtime runs out here. So other medication selections, and again, this, here's all the papers where you can go find this. The Johnstone et al. 2005 is a really great resource for this. Lithium for paroxysms, really not going to be helpful, very dangerous. Some of the more nuanced anticonvulsants. Clonidine tends to roll in, like silk and roll out like a sledgehammer. Once people get put on these medications, it can be really, really hard to get them off, and they can, in fact, have seizures. So, all things to consider. And, with just a few moments left to spare here, this was, this last piece that I'm going to close, a bit of an experiential for all of you, intended for psychiatrists learning to use ketamine, psilocybin, and MDMA to add to their practices. And I hope that it's something that helps connect the dots in all of this for you. So I invite you to just take a moment and look at this. Forget where it might have come from or what electrode it's tied to, and just sit with it. Let your curiosity take you to wherever it wants to go. Now look for the largest waves, the biggest rhythms you see in this file. And consider, how is this part of the brain communicating with its neighbors, near neighbors, far neighbors? Is this a collaborative communicative process or not? Is this a collaborative conversation or not? Look for waves riding on waves and see where you might see that. And the biggest question I have for you as lay people, or in the neurotherapy world, not so lay people, how does this make you feel when you look at it? Take a couple deep breaths. Shake that off. Shake it off. And look at this. And again, let your curiosity take you. What draws your interest? Where do your eyes want to go? Look for the largest waves, the biggest rhythms. How are they communicating with their neighbors, near neighbors, far neighbors? Is this a collaborative conversation or not? Look for places where you see waves riding on waves. The most important question, how does it make you feel when you look at it? So a little bit of the backstory on this. The EEG on the left was someone who was referred to me here at my clinic, suffering from deep depression, no reported suicidal ideation, scheduled for ECT, electroconvulsive therapy. And I recorded their EEG, and I took a look at their paperwork and saw that they were taking fentanyl, Dilaudid, Abilify, Losartan, Xanax, rosuvastatin, might have butchered that, but hopefully you'll work with me here, Reglan, Estradiol, Lamictal, Trazodone, and ketamine. Wow. So I looked at the EEG and I reached out to Nick Dogres, Dr. Dogres at Neurofield. In addition to running the product company for Neurofield, Nick also runs a neurotherapy program for the Florida House Addiction Recovery Center. He's one of my QEEG mentors of record. And so I talked to Nick and I looked at the EEG, we went over it, we came up with a couple of plans. I said, Nick, I'm really arriving there. I'm really just scared I'm going to hurt this person. And we talked about that for a bit, and we landed that that was really likely going to be the case. And that my position where I landed was I thought this person needed to go to rehab, maybe 2 full cycles of rehab to see what we could get them off of and get a cleaner looking EEG. So I brought the client back in with their partner and shared with them where I had landed. I said, look, I think you really need to go to rehab, under care of a appropriate medical provider, not me, certainly not me. I'm not credentialed to do that work. And then, when you've gone through that, let's, along the way, we may get a few EEGs, but, we need to get a cleaner sample. And the person's response was, I don't take drugs. Why are you suggesting rehab? And I said, I'm terribly sorry, but you do. And a question I would put to anyone listening here today, is there one person on this call who would put their hand up and say, I'm actually psychologically, physiologically resilient enough to tolerate that cocktail of medications? Who is resilient enough to do that? And I mean, I understand how it gets there. You try something, it doesn't work. You layer something else on, it doesn't work, and you end up in this place. But it's who can tolerate that? And the brain on the right. This was a collaboration between Will Vanderveer, Dr. Vanderveer, and I a couple of years ago by a mutual client who introduced the two of us. And this is that client's brain in the middle of a ketamine session. Now, this person had lived with depression and anxiety, some attachment issue, and struggles in their primary romantic relationship. And, I would encourage you, like, just from a lay person's perspective, if you look at these two things side by side, which of them might look like a path to healing? Thank you very much for your time.